All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the UK Beef webinar series. My name is Dare Bullock. I'm one of the beef specialists here located in Lexington. I have most of my core cohorts on here tonight. And we have a special guest tonight. We brought in, this is 2 months in a row. We've had an out of state speaker, and tonight's speaker is Dr. Matt Spangler. Matt is at the University of Nebraska. Many of you may have seen he's been around the state a couple of times. Matt, we appreciate that. He's helped us out with the Beef Efficiency Conference a few years back. And then a year or so ago, helped when we had our seed stock symposium. And so we brought him in. Actually, I said University of Nebraska. He's actually in Southern California right now, but not fighting fires. And so he was able to take a little break and help us out tonight. Very important topic for us. We're about to get into bull buying season, and Matt's going to go over some things. I put in some of the information I sent to you guys about some software that he has that I'm sure he'll talk about that also has a neat feature to it that kind of goes over what traits are important for selecting under certain management situations, and even gives an indication of how much emphasis we should be placing on some of those traits. And so I guess I'm going to just turn it over to you, Matt. I really do appreciate you helping us out. I didn't go over your pedigree and all, but I think your name is out there well enough. Most people have read things that you've written and know you pretty well. So just going to turn it over to you, and we appreciate you joining us.
Sounds great. Thanks, Dare, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to visit with the group here this evening. The title, I guess, I chose. I just want to kind of go through this evening some different scenarios and think about, relatively speaking, where we might consider putting more or less emphasis as you folks go out and think about buying bulls. In my mind, it all starts with the breeding objective, and I'm sure the group has heard about breeding objectives before, but I thought it merited revisiting them because it's really hard to envision going out and finding bulls that are actually going to lead to improved profitability if you don't have a well-formed breeding objective to start with. Because breeding objectives should identify the traits that are what I'd call economically relevant for a given enterprise. And you can think of a breeding objective as really a description of operational goals, including how replacement females are going to be procured. So raise your own replacement females, or are you going to purchase them? How and when animals are going to be sold. For a lot of folks, I'm guessing that's at weaning, but some people maybe have some backgrounding or even retain ownership into the feed yard. I put here management and environmental constraints. So a chief management constraint is you just don't have enough labor, and so that in some ways can dictate which traits we need to put more or less emphasis on. Certainly, environmental constraints. I think about how variable forage or feed availability is, and then the cost associated with it. And then the last thing I mentioned here is the time horizon to consider profit. So, an example, if I'm completely terminal, I don't keep back any replacement females, then my planning horizon is pretty short. But if I keep back replacement females, then I may have a much longer planning horizon, the length of time to consider the costs and revenues associated with a single genetic selection decision. And so that length of time that somebody plans on looking at the consequences of the bull buying decision can impact how much traits are, or which traits are influential and by what degree. So maybe just some foundational things here. It's probably not news to anyone listening that EPDs enable directional change, and you can look at the genetic trends for whatever your favorite breed is, And you can see that we've changed all kinds of traits, right? We've made animals bigger, generally speaking, increased marbling, decreased calving difficulty, right? And that's all because of the use of EPDs. But I'd argue that progress should be conditioned on what our objective is. In other words, for some of us, depending on what our breeding objective is, what our situation is, making animals bigger may not be the right thing. We may be more profitable if we make them smaller. Maybe more calving ease isn't what we need either. Maybe we need to put our emphasis someplace else. So that the way in which we select up or down really depends on where we're starting from. And that's what I mentioned here. Clear objectives require knowledge of where you're starting from. So if the goal is profit, then focus on the traits that are tied to revenue and cost. And the emphasis placed on those economically relevant traits, or ERT, depends on what your situation is. So this is kind of a long way of saying that what's good for me may not be what's good or best for you, right? We all have different needs. So a little bit of a quiz here. It's easy to do this on Zoom. I don't see people's hands or fingers, but just kind of a quiz of what's economically relevant. So the first example I have here is birth weight. That's BWT versus calving ease. And so I'd ask the group, which is the economically relevant trait? And the answer I'd hope I'd get is that calving ease is economically relevant. Still, you see a lot of birth weight EPDs and actual birth weights in sale catalogs. I know it, but calving ease is a thing that's directly tied to a cost. Next one is MWT. That's my abbreviation for mature cow weight versus frame score, FS. Maybe another contentious one. I'd argue that we feed weight. And certainly then when we cull a cow, we get paid by the pound. So I'd argue that mature cow weight is actually economically relevant because of that. The third one, weaning weight versus carcass weight. And this obviously depends on when you sell calves. If you sell at weaning, then weaning weight's economically relevant to you. But you have to keep in mind somebody's going to buy that animal and is going to sell them based on a carcass weight someday. So in our industry, given the segmentation, some of these weight traits, it really depends on who you are, which one's economically relevant for your enterprise. And then the last one I have here, RFI, residual feed intake versus feed intake. And again, I'd argue feed intake is the economically relevant one because we pay for feed by the pound or by the ton. We don't get charged for the residual. So just a few examples to maybe contextualize what I mean by economically relevant, and certainly encourage you as you go through and think about buying bulls to do the same thing. Think about which EPDs are for a trait that's economically relevant to your enterprise and focus on that subset. So that begs the question, what are the economically relevant traits for me? So if I think about an enterprise that sells calves at weaning and retains replacement females, which I think would fit an awful lot of enterprises, the traits that I think of are female fertility, cow feed cost, calf feed cost, the sale weight of the calves, so it's weaning weight, sale weight of the cull cows, that's a source of revenue, mortality and morbidity, right? So those are the things that I think of as being economically relevant. Now, as you look over that list, there's a lot of those that we have EPDs for, but there's some we really don't. You get to the mortality and morbidity bit. Certainly, extreme calving difficulty issues can cause mortality problems, calf and cow. But other than that, we really don't have EPDs that get at those. So how do we map the economically relevant traits in our our breeding goal to EPD that we have? Well, for female fertility, you think of heifer pregnancy, but probably more importantly, you should think about sustained fertility. So, depending on the breed organization, they may call that stability. They may call it sustained cow fertility, functional longevity, all different names for the same thing. Cow feed cost, maybe think of mature cow weight principally. Then also I put milk here, that's really maternal weaning weight. Sale weight of calves, that's weaning weight direct, so the weaning weight EPD and weaning weight maternal or milk. Calf feed cost, maybe milk. Sale weight of cull cows, that's mature weight EPD. And then, as I alluded to before, for mortality and morbidity, maybe calving ease direct, how easily a bull's calves will be born when he's bred to heifers, or calving ease maternal, how easily his daughters will give birth during their first parity. So it's a mapping exercise for knowing what are the profit drivers for my enterprise and what are the EPD that most closely align with those profit drivers. But what if I retain ownership of calves? Now all of a sudden the list got longer, didn't it? Because I have to add all of this stuff that occurs post weaning. So quality grade, components of yield grade, and then the sale weight of calves would be different. So no longer at weaning, obviously it would be carcass weight. So the list of traits gets longer, is my point, as the longer you retain ownership on the animals. And if you're somebody that doesn't retain your own replacement females, I made the comment here that your job just got easier, because from those lists you can remove everything related to maternal. So fertility, calving ease maternal, milk, all that stuff. But the point is whoever your maternal supplier is should be emphasizing those. And ideally, your maternal supplier should be getting you crossbred cows if you're in commercial cattle production. And even better yet, it'd be great if you could get those coming with their second or later calf, because somebody's already gone through the difficulty of calving out the heifers and getting her bred back the second time. So done a lot of that hard work. I understand people would say, well, it's hard to find those kind of suppliers, and I'm not going to disagree with you. And maybe a bit external to what I want to try to get through tonight, but I think there'd be a lot of advantages for folks if they were able to do this. All right, I want to go through some examples here using software that Dara alluded to called iGen Deck. It's available through the Beef Improvement or BIF group, and I have that web address here. What this is web-based decision support software that helps people build their own customized economic selection index, and I used it to build some examples to try to go through what I call relative emphasis. And so, relatively speaking, where should I put more or less of my selection pressure? So just a couple of screenshots of the software. This is one of the first pages where you can choose the sale endpoint of your calves. And then what I have here is index type. Basically, is it terminal or am I keeping back replacement females? And the answers to those two questions already kind of set the list of traits which should be in somebody's breeding objective. Now, the degree to which those traits are important really depends on other information that the user would put in about how their herd performs currently, and then the input costs, and then projected sale price of calves. And so based on what I put on that previous screen, it'll checkbox EPDs that it thinks should be in my index. So here, weaning weight, direct and maternal, mature cow weight, has those in there. This planning horizon thing up here, again, that's the length of time to consider the revenues and costs associated with a bull selection decision. And I'll go through how that's impactful and why more people should think about it. And then also information here, I've got what's my conception rate, calving loss rate. That's calving loss rate due to dystocia. So getting at the chance of losing a calf, and in extreme cases, also losing the cow because of a difficult birth. So just an example of how the user can begin to tell the system kind of what their herd looks like. And then behind the scenes, what happens is we simulate a very large herd of cattle using the parameters that the user defines. And then here I've got cow age distribution. So you can envision how changing this distribution would impact how important things like heifer pregnancy, or in particular sustained cow fertility or stayability, would be. And then here, the value of calves when I plan to sell them at weaning. And what I always tell people is to think about kind of 5 to 10 year averages, right? I don't know what calves are going to sell for in October of 2025, but I do know what they have sold for on average the past several years, and so that's usually a good approach to take. And then annual cow cost. Anyone that's looking at this default value here of $288 thinks, my goodness, I had to move everything to Nebraska. It's not that cheap to run a cow in Nebraska, and I know it's not that cheap to run a cow where you folks are either. But people can enter what their variable cow cost is, and that gets at things like how important decreasing mature cow weight might be. And then the output from the program is this. These are marginal economic values associated with the traits in my index. So it says in this case, another pound of hot carcass weight, all else held the same, is worth a $1.40, right? And so what these marginal economic values are then are the weighting of traits in somebody's customized index. So you would take these marginal economic values and multiply them by the trait EPD, and then you sum all of that together to get the index. Okay, so that's the software I use to build the examples I'm going to go through. In this first one, this is a pie chart, which is actually an output from iGenDeck, and it shows what we call the relative emphasis. So relatively speaking, which traits are really the drivers of profit for somebody's breeding objective. And on the left-hand side of the slide here, I go through kind of what I assumed in building this particular index. Used 10-year price averages from Oklahoma City. Assumed the annual cow cost was $600. The maximum cow age was 10. These were 1,300-pound cows, and I assumed 1% death loss from dystocia. So I think that's probably some fairly fair, if you will, assumptions. Max cow age may be a little bit long, but overall, I think this would catch a lot of people. So with these kind of assumptions, close to half of the relative emphasis should be put on decreasing mature cow weight. Roughly a quarter is on improving weaning weight direct, and only about 4% on improving calving ease direct. So again, I think a scenario that probably fits a lot of people, but I would wager that probably for the people this does fit, probably not very many would think about the relative emphasis in quite this way. What I did next is I increased cow cost to $800. That's variable cow cost, $800 a year, and kept everything else the same. When I do that, now close to 2/3 of the emphasis should be on decreasing mature cow weight, and only about 20% on improving weaning weight direct. So that's substantial. Now, it may not be fair, you could argue, to say, well, you increased cow cost, but you didn't change the sale price or the value of calves. Maybe. but I think it's still good to look at what happens as cow cost continues to go up, because at least I know where I am, or where I live, maybe not where I am right now. That's certainly the scenario. We see cow costs continuing to go up. Now I looked at what's the impact if I actually had younger cows. So I reduced the maximum cow age to 6, and then roughly 20% of the breeding objective said you got to increase or improve stayability or sustain cow fertility, right? So changing that maximum cow age, really making the cow herd younger, if you will, all of a sudden the impact of something like sustained fertility jumped up considerably. Now on this one, what I did was I increased death loss due to dystocia to 5%. It was at 1% before. Now I increased it to 5%, which is huge, right? If you're losing 5% of your calves due to calving difficulty, I mean it's the kind of year that makes you wonder, do you ever want to do it again, right? So really, really substantial change here. And in doing that, only about 10% of the relative emphasis in this index was on improving calving ease. So calving ease is one that at least economically speaking, most people probably overemphasize. Now that said, I get it. If you don't have calving problems, you never want to have calving problems. So you emphasize it maybe more than the economics says you should. And in that case, really what it is a decision based on risk, right? Which is fine as long as you recognize that potentially you're leaving some profit on the table by making that decision based on risk. Now I did both. So large dystocia problem and young cows. And when you do that, calving ease direct emphasis jumped up to about 11%, right? Because the calving difficulty problems more likely to occur in younger females. So I have more younger females. And so I got it up to about 11%. So again, just for people to think about if any of these scenarios kind of match you, where in general you maybe need to put more or less emphasis compared to maybe what you've traditionally done. Right here, what I did is looked at length of planting horizon and the relative emphasis of all these traits. So there's calving ease direct, heifer pregnancy, stayability, weaning weight maternal, calving ease maternal, mature cow weight, and weaning weight direct, and looked at how their relative emphasis changes as the length of the planting horizon increases. And you can see if I have a longer term view on the world, if you will, that traits like stayability begin to increase in terms of their importance much further out than a trait like, let's say, weaning weight does. So in other words, if I'm putting a whole lot of selection pressure on weaning weight at the sacrifice of sustained cow fertility, it says I'm really thinking about maximizing profit in the short term, and that could be at the sacrifice of profit in the longer term. I did the same thing, assuming the endpoint of calves now were fed cattle, and I know that that may not fit a whole lot of people that are listening, but you see a similar story. So a trait like stayability increases in terms of its importance considerably right around the 20-year mark, although a trait like carcass weight always the most important. So this is just a snapshot maybe of indexes that are on offer right now by a lot of breed associations. And if I didn't list your favorite breed up here, apologies, that wasn't with malice aforethought. I just didn't put them all on here, but this at least gets a lot of them. And there's a couple of points I want to make here. One is I've delineated them as terminal and general purpose. General purpose means that the retention of females is contemplated in the index. So there are female-related traits. Terminal, it's just what it sounds like. It assumes that every calf born is destined to go to the feed yard. The other thing, so you got to use the right tool for the right job. The other thing I want to mention is even in the general purpose index, the majority of these assume that all coal heifers and all steer calves that you're retaining ownership through the feed yard. The exception to that is Angus's $M and Beefmaster's $M, where they assume there's a weaned calf that's the product. So you've got to be aware if you're selling at weaning, what the index assumes. Does it actually assume you're selling at weaning, or does it assume you're retaining ownership through the feed yard? Because it's going to put emphasis on different traits. So that's the problem, that a lot of these indexes assume the terminal endpoint is a carcass, and they put selection emphasis on a different suite of traits than what we might do if we assumed that we were selling weaned calves. So that's nothing that anyone in the audience can necessarily fix, but it's something that certainly you need to be aware of. And those two, just to highlight the fact, those two breeding objectives are dramatically different. If I assume I retain ownership versus I sell at weaning. And on the upper left here, in an index that says I'm going to retain ownership through the feed yard, weaning weight has about a 2% emphasis, and it's actually negative, right? So I don't want to start off with really big cattle. And if you look over here, the relative emphasis, if I assumed that I'm selling it at weaning, puts about a 30% emphasis on weaning weight, right? So those breeding objectives are just totally different. And this just further illustrates that. I think I've got circle that showed up there. So here the W's are indexes that sell at weaning. The C's are indexes that sell in the beef. And the numbers behind them are the length of the planning horizon. And the point is that overall the correlation, the rank correlation across, I think we looked at 2,000 or 3,000 bulls in this. The rank correlation between indexes selling at weaning versus carcass was I guess technically high, 0.71, but there'd be a lot of re-ranking. In other words, if you're choosing a bull based on a carcass index, but actually selling at weaning, you're probably leaving some money on the table by doing that. So I suppose for people that do want to use indexes but actually sell their calves at weaning, there's not probably a lot of great options. Suppose you could use iGenDec to develop your own weaning index. You could use the carcass-based indexes that are available. And if you had a weaning index available to you, you might want to still use some what I'd call independent culling levels for post-weaning traits, just to make sure your cattle still are demanded downstream, right? And I just want to go over this to illustrate what the opportunity cost is of some of those different options. So what I did was I built several different indexes, and then I chose the top 100 bulls and looked at what their average index value was. So over here on the far left, I built economic index, assuming I sell cattle at weaning, and those top 100 bulls, their average index value was 184. Then I chose the top 100 bulls based on a carcass endpoint index, and I looked at what their average weaning index value was. So what this tells me is that if I really sell at weaning, but I use a carcass index to select bulls, in my example at least, I'm giving up about $12 a head, okay, $12 for every calf I make by doing that. And if you can command, I guess, additional money for your calves because they do have carcass genetics, if you will, built into them, then that's fine. Uh, if we go on the far right, what I did here is said, well, I'm not going to use indexes at all. I'm just going to use these independent culling levels. So these thresholds I set for every trait that I think is important to me. And then I looked at, well, of the top 100 bulls that I selected that way, what was their average weaning index value? And it was pretty low. So I'm giving up $20 to $40 a head by this kind of seat of the pants approach. So I guess the take home is index selection is obviously what people like Dare and I would advocate you do. And in the examples I've run, even if there's not a weaning index available to you, the carcass one seems to at least point you in the right direction, and far better than just going through and trying to ad hoc weight the traits yourself. So to I guess impart some concluding thoughts. Overall, defining a breeding objective is really where it starts, and actually knowing profit. And I think that's at least in a lot of producers I work with, that's really something that we don't always do a great job of, is actually knowing what our cow cost is. Things like that. And if you don't know it, it's hard to know how much you actually need to improve some of these traits. The emphasis that you put on different traits needs to be determined by what your breeding objective is, your current performance of the herd, and some knowledge of economics of your herd. So you got to have a sense for, well, what is my dystocia rate right now? How big are my calves when I sell them? How big are my cows? All of those kinds of things then help you determine where you need to put more or less emphasis. The scenarios that I walk through this evening aren't exhaustive, but hopefully are enough to at least spark some conversation and maybe get people thinking about in general where they need to put more emphasis than they have historically, or where they should put less. Put a plug in for our sire selection manual. Dare obviously has these, but I think an extremely useful resource that has chapters on all things beef cattle genetics related and meant for producers. So I'd like to plug just a few more websites before I'm done. Of course, UNL's beef production website. I think by state law in Nebraska, I have to plug that one. ebeef.org. And then I mentioned it before, the Beef Improvement Federation, beefimprovement.org. That's where you can find that iGen deck tool that I use to build a lot of the examples with tonight. So with that, happy to take any questions that might exist.
Thanks a bunch, Matt. Yeah, if everybody has any questions, if you would just put them in the chat, and we'll monitor that and get those answered for you. And Matt, just to refresh my memory, I think what you've told me is if folks are interested in that, the iGenDeck software, that they can go on and create like a guest account and get a month for free. Is that correct? And they can play around with it and do what they'd like. Now, I know you don't like people just dabbling like that, but if they could work with their county agent or even work with me, be happy to kind of give them some pointers. But just your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So BIF actually to defray the costs of hosting that software, they charge for access, and so there's one price for BIF members, and then another price for a higher price for non-BIF members, and those account types are for people that are actually going to build indexes and market animals based off of them or select animals based off of them. It's free for extension use, um, free for use in the classroom. So we've had some universities use it. Um, but then there is, and what you were mentioning there is what we call an evaluation account. And so that's basically a free 30-day trial for people to kind of kick the tires a little bit. So yeah, I'd encourage anyone that wants to sign up for one of those evaluation accounts and play with it.
Yep, and like I say, if you get in there and do that, and wanted to discuss any of it, just shoot me an email or whatever, and we can kind of go through some things. Again, have any questions? Pop them in there. Just to Matt, I think when I got to playing around with this, and we're one of those that are guilty of using it in our classroom. The Jeff and Les and I teach the beef production class, and we use it in there. And this year was the first year, and really got a lot of value out of it. Some light bulbs went on, not only for the students, but I think for me as well, when I started playing with it and looking at some of those emphasis, on the traits. I'll put it. I'm gonna ask you first, and then I'll tell you what my reaction. What was your biggest surprise on doing kind of some typical cow calf management type of operation, selling it, weaning, or after backgrounding? When you developed this, what surprised you when you saw the results of where the emphasis should have been placed based on what you had maybe historically thought those values would have been?
Yeah, so one thing that surprised me is using probably more realistic cow costs, just how much emphasis is placed on decreasing mature cow weight. I mean, it's not surprising to me. It's important, but for a lot of these indexes, it takes a lot of the relative emphasis. And then the other one probably is using realistic values for incidence of dystocia, just how little emphasis something like calving yeast gets. Those are two that are I think fairly eye opening.
Yep, those those were absolutely the two that really caught me off guard, and probably Katie and Jeff might have beg to differ with us on the cow weight thing. They probably had a little better concept of that than probably we did, because that's where it comes in. We kind of think, well, it's going to be offset because we're going to eventually sell those great big old cows, but it just doesn't catch up enough in terms of selling those cows to make up for how much feed we've poured into them over their 10-year lifespan.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, but the way I think about it too is if you can decrease cow size and you assume you have a fixed land base, then that means you could actually have more cows, right? More smaller cows. So that allows you to hopefully then market more calves. Yeah.
Yeah, and on the dystocia thing, I kind of with the class, I kind of pushed it to the limit even, and I put a scenario in where we were actually breeding all heifers, and had some dystocia issues already. And the emphasis, it's really hard to push it extremely high. I mean, even when you go to say that you're breeding all heifers and have, say, a 5% dystocia issue, the emphasis, I can't remember now, but I want to say it was around 20%, a little, maybe it been a little over 20% was kind of the highest I could get it to.
Yeah, which is very high. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, guys, it's your opportunity. Chime in here. I can pester Matt all night long, but if you guys have any questions, I'd love to hear from some of you guys. The other one, kind of a practical question for you, Matt, is talking about using those what I call a canned selection index that the breed associations give us, and I'm slowly coming around to given the advice that you're giving, that in the absence of a better index, that say I'm going to use Simmental as an example, using the API index, even though you're not even though it puts emphasis on carcasses, and our guys might not be selling carcasses. Um, is there can you find a bull that's got maybe that high index API index, and I guess I know you can't do this on a large number of bulls, but if you're kind of torn between two bulls and both of them have a relatively high index, would it be crazy to go in there and look at then the individual values, and maybe if one of those bulls had an extremely high, say, marbling EPD that probably drove that index up, uh, think about maybe the other bull for my situation then might be a better option because I'm not going to get paid for that marbling value. Is that going a little bit too much into it?
Yeah, you could. I think to do that, as you said, the two bulls need to have the same or very close to the same index values to start with. But then, yeah, looking at how they got there and which one got there for the traits that are most important to you. Yeah, that could be done. Yeah.
And the other one that I suspect that a lot of people have questions about, because it's one of the traits that I hear probably as much or more of than anything, is docility. And I know that docility is not part of the indexes you guys put together with iGendeck. Do you want to talk about docility and what folks might want to do with that?
Yeah, so I think for people buying bulls, they probably want to think about docility two different ways. One is the genetic potential of that bull to make calves that are more docile, and that's where the docility EPD comes into play. But for a lot of folks, they're probably also concerned with how docile is that bull himself, because they got to work around that bull. And so that's one of the few places where I could actually advocate for selection on phenotype, right? Is the bull wild himself, or is he docile, right? And so then it's kind of a just an independent culling level. If he's wild, I don't want anything to do with him. And then particularly if people are keeping back replacement females, making sure the docility EPD is on the right side of breed average would make some sense.
Yeah. Okay, we got a question. The question that we got was, does herd size have an impact on the outputs of the ERTs?
Um, so the examples I built, and the reason why we simulate this is we wanted to simulate a very large herd, because otherwise in smaller herds, a one, let's say a 1 unit change in heifer pregnancy, right? You may not see it because there aren't enough cows. So if you're using your own herd to do these kinds of things, a smaller herd, um, it might be hard to observe uh, the same things that we see in simulating data from a much larger population. Um, I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but I think uh, the recommendations though should still be the same. I mean, relatively speaking, regardless of herd size, um, um, there's certain traits that should receive more emphasis than others.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I wonder where I usually think of herd size is really more to do with not the EPDs to focus on, or the emphasis or things like that. It just really has more to do with probably how much you can afford to pay for the bull, to spread those costs out, and that probably has more to do, I would think, with herd size than anything.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Uh, the number of exposures I can get from a bull in his lifetime in part dictate how much money I can spend on him. Yep.
Yeah, for a lot of our guys, that's gonna, that have a two calving seasons and things like that. They can definitely, they may get 50, 60 calves out of a bull and can afford to pay a little bit more for him maybe.
Right. Yep.
So I'm going to share my screen, Matt. I'm going to steal it from you. We've got a little information for folks on the upcoming one. And also, if you have time to pop in a question, if you've got one, we'll be happy to take it. But just to let you guys know, the next one, oh shoot, I forgot to put the date. Who remembers? It's February. Hang on, I can find it here real quick.
I think
It is
the 11th.
the 11th.
Yep, it's the 11th.
Okay, February 11th, and we're going to have Dr. Kenny Burdine and Kevin Laurent. They're going to be talking about marketing opportunities for the spring. Believe it or not, Matt, when we talk about marketing, usually brings out a really big crowd. Although, also for everybody, the CAPE code, if you're trying to get the educational credit for CAPE, what you do is you put the code UK Bulls, and that will go where the speaker signature normally goes. But now I also want to tell you that none of that comes through us. We really have nothing to do with the CAPE educational part other than providing you guys with the code. It's your responsibility to put that in that signature line, and then your county agent is the one that has to sign off on those documents. So we don't send out a report or any of that. It all has to be done by you by using that code and putting that into the and getting and then still processing it through your county agent. All right, gang. I'm gonna open it up one last time if anybody has any last minute questions. But in the meantime, we do appreciate Dr. Spangler for joining us tonight. Matt, we really appreciate it. I know that you actually have places to go. You have another talk to give tonight. He's out on the West Coast, so it's still early there. And he actually has another presentation to give here in a little bit. So we're going to cut him loose if you guys don't have any more questions. But Matt, as always, we really appreciate it. I think some extremely valuable information, and thanks for being on with us tonight.
You bet. My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn. Yep. Did you say something, Les?
Just thanking Matt.
Okay. Good deal. All right, everybody. Well, good night. Everybody stay safe in this cold weather, and we'll see you next month then, February 11th, for the marketing. Take care.